kingdom can die long before its armies are finally destroyed on the battlefield. It can die when the law fractures, when public confidence evaporates, when subjects no longer agree on who truly holds the authority to rule. In AD 1428, the Kingdom of France stood exactly at that terrifying threshold. The epic-defining struggle later remembered through the incandescent figure of Joan of Arc was not merely a military episode, nor was it a simple tale of foreign invasion. It was a harrowing referendum on sovereignty itself. It was a question of whether a shattered realm could still believe in its own fundamental right to exist. By the late phase of the 100 Years' War, the French crown confronted a crisis far more lethal than English longbows. It confronted a system-wide failure of authority. The old historical habit of treating this era as a mere sequence of sieges and cavalry charges misses the central horror of the age. Battles mattered, certainly. Blood was shed in massive, agonizing quantities. But the deeper, more consequential contest was over the invisible architecture of legitimacy. Who could issue commands that proud nobles would actually obey? Who could demand taxes that impoverished towns would actually finance? Who could summon priests to bless their cause and compel the common people to recognize their edicts as lawful? That question had become dangerously, perhaps terminally, unsettled. The English monarchy, led by highly capable and ruthless administrators, was not simply raiding across the channel for plunder. It was pressing a systematic, legally documented dynastic claim into a French political body that was already bleeding out from internal rivalry, fiscal starvation, and dynastic instability. The powerful Duchy of Burgundy, pursuing its own sovereignty with cold, hard strategic calculation, had aligned with the English against the Armagnac faction that supported the French Dauphin, Charles. Therefore, France was not one coherent nation resisting an external enemy. It was a divided, cannibalistic political organism. It was a landscape of competing elites using foreign alliances as raw instruments in a vicious domestic struggle for dominance. This is precisely what makes the period so shockingly modern in its ruthless logic, even while it remains thoroughly medieval in its language. The dispute was conducted through the vocabulary of oaths, bloodlines, and sacred ritual. But beneath that archaic surface lay the timeless, mechanical anatomy of state failure. Fractured legitimacy, exhausted finances, widespread elite betrayal, and populations utterly unsure which authority would still possess the power of life and death tomorrow. The poison at the very center of this civilizational crisis was the Treaty of Troyes, signed in AD 1420. Under its disastrous terms, the mentally unstable French king, Charles VI, a man who suffered from bouts of madness so severe, he sometimes believed he was made of glass, effectively disinherited his own son, the Dauphin. The treaty legally recognized Henry V of England and his heirs as the rightful successors to the French throne. This was not a normal diplomatic settlement to end a border dispute. It was an act of absolute political dismemberment dressed in pristine legal form. If accepted, the treaty made any resistance to the English line not merely difficult, but legally treasonous and spiritually perilous. It transformed the war from a contest of brute force into a high-stakes battle over who counted as the rightful ruler in the eyes of God, the law, and society. Here lay the treaty's strategic brilliance and its immensely corrosive danger. A sword can seize a town, but it requires infinite resources to hold it. A legal document that is believed, however, can seize a nation's entire future. But the treaty worked so effectively only because France was already broken from within. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions had driven the kingdom into a generational cycle of vendetta, assassination, and crippling mistrust. Great lords maneuvered as if the kingdom were a private estate to be partitioned, rather than a state to be preserved. Local loyalties vastly overrode any abstract sense of French patriotism. Many besieged towns were far less concerned with the high theory of dynastic succession than they were with sheer survival, avoiding ruinous taxation, and preventing their citizens from being slaughtered in a sack. Roving bands of mercenaries moved through the devastated landscape, functioning simultaneously as a vital military resource and a catastrophic social threat. Royal finance was thoroughly inadequate for the scale of the emergency. Therefore, every French defeat became something vastly more dangerous than a mere battlefield loss. Every retreat became concrete evidence that the crown itself was hollow. A monarchy shrinks exponentially faster in its reputation than it does in its physical territory. Once subjects begin to suspect that the political center cannot protect them, their obedience turns conditional. And conditional obedience is the first stage of revolution or conquest. In such a hyper-fragile environment, strategic geography became inseparable from mass psychology. The city of Orléans, besieged in AD 1428 and AD 1429, was not simply another walled settlement under pressure. It was the hinge of the entire Loire River corridor. It was a geographic gateway whose fall threatened to violently sever what remained of loyal France, exposing the Dauphin's southern refuge in Bourges to catastrophic, undeniable isolation. If Orléans fell, the English and their Burgundian allies would not automatically conquer the entire kingdom the next morning. History rarely grants such clean, cinematic endings. But its collapse would exponentially intensify the appearance that French collapse everywhere else was merely a matter of time. An organized state can survive a tremendous number of military setbacks. It severely struggles to survive a widely accepted public expectation of its own extinction. Orléans stood at the exact point where strategic consequence and symbolic consequence fused into one apocalyptic crisis. Medieval politics made that fusion even more severe because religion and rulership were not separate partitioned chambers of human life. Divine favor was not merely a private consolation for the pious. It was the fundamental operating system of political power. Kings ruled by hereditary right, certainly, but they also operated within a cosmic universe where sacred sanction was the ultimate currency of legitimacy. Ritual, prophecy, sacrament, and providence were tightly woven into the DNA of public authority. Therefore, a royal claimant who appeared to be abandoned by God was not merely unfortunate. He was politically endangered at the deepest possible level. If heaven seemed silent in the face of continuous French slaughter, rivals could present that silence as an ultimate divine judgment. If military reverses multiplied year after year, they could be interpreted by the masses not just as tactical failures of logistics or command, but as metaphysical disapproval. That was the dark abyss opening beneath the feet of the Dauphin Charles. He was not yet Charles VII in the full, binding, sacramental sense recognized by sacred tradition. He was a claimant surrounded by agonizing doubt, paralyzed by factional infighting, and advised by practical men who were forced to operate in a world where the practical and the providential simply could not be disentangled. Charles himself was a figure heavily shaped by caution, primarily because extreme caution had become an absolute necessity for his physical survival. He was politically vulnerable, financially destitute, and deeply insecure about his own legitimacy, plagued by rumors of his mother's infidelity. He was not a theatrically heroic warrior king. Too much confidence from his court would have been entirely reckless, yet too much passivity was proving fatal. Around him gathered a desperate coalition of advisors, clerics, nobles, and mercenary captains who had to ruthlessly balance military necessity against the constant, looming threat of scandal, fraud, and public humiliation. A pretender's court is especially exposed to the deadly weapon of ridicule. Therefore, any extraordinary claim of divine intervention carried a double danger. It might miraculously save the regime, but it might just as easily expose its terminal weakness. To embrace a charlatan would invite devastating clerical embarrassment and hand the English a supreme propaganda victory. Yet, to reject a genuine providential sign, in the deeply ingrained mentality of the age, might amount to refusing heaven's last, desperate offer of salvation. Into this utterly impossible, suffocating atmosphere entered Joan of Arc. She was a peasant girl from the frontier village of Domremy, who bluntly declared that saints had instructed her to lift the siege, aid the Dauphin, and drive the English military machine out of France entirely. Her later, towering fame can easily obscure the agonizing initial problem she represented to the power structure. At first, Joan was not yet a national heroine. She was a gatekeeping crisis. What in God's name was a desperate, highly educated, but deeply hierarchical royal court supposed to do with an impossible, grandiose message delivered from the absolute social margins? The answer to that question reveals an enormous amount about how states behave under extreme civilizational pressure. Joan was not dismissed outright because France's elites were totally cornered. Conventional military methods had stalled into irrelevance. Defensive endurance was rapidly becoming indistinguishable from a strategic, agonizingly slow death. Morale had decayed into fatalism. The old, aristocratic formulas of command no longer generated an ounce of confidence among the rank and file. In such dire moments, when the orthodox machinery of survival fails, the improbable suddenly becomes actionable. This was not mass irrationality. It was emergency reasoning in a deeply religious culture where prophecy, signs, and providence still fundamentally shaped the elite imagination. When established, rational instruments of statecraft fail to halt a collapse, sophisticated systems begin testing excluded, unorthodox possibilities. Joan's exhaustive examination at Poitiers by learned theologians mattered precisely because the decision to deploy her was not an act of blind, simple faith. Clerics and aristocratic advisors scrutinized her claims, her virginity, her character, and her theological orthodoxy as carefully as the dire circumstances allowed. Such rigorous vetting did not prove divine origin in any modern scientific sense. That standard would be wildly anachronistic. But it established something far more vital for Charles, something politically sufficient. It established that she could be utilized as a weapon without inviting immediate theological disgrace. Therefore, the regime made a cold, calculated gamble. Joan would be outfitted with armor, given a household, and sent toward the meat grinder of Orléans. This happened not because every cynical skeptic in the room had vanished, and not because the sophisticated court society had suddenly become incredibly naive. It happened because the catastrophic strategic situation had violently narrowed the acceptable range of caution. At some point in the life cycle of a dying state, refusing to take a risk becomes the greatest risk of all. Here, a profound historical distortion must be corrected. Joan was not a solitary military genius in the modern staff college sense of command, appearing from nowhere to magically outthink every hardened veteran around her. The French armies remained led by highly experienced, brutal captains like Dunois and La Hire. Sieges still strictly obeyed the hard, unforgiving logic of fortifications, supply lines, weather, timing, and force concentration. But Joan possessed another form of power that is often entirely unquantifiable, harder to measure, and therefore vastly easier for modern observers to underestimate. She accelerated operations. She violently stiffened wavering resolve. She constantly, aggressively pressed commanders who were naturally inclined toward endless delay into immediate, high-risk offensive action. She transformed sluggish military movement into high-stakes moral theater. She made the physical act of relief itself appear as undeniable evidence of a divine momentum. That specific kind of force can fundamentally alter war, because war is never only an arithmetic of swords, arrows, and grain supplies. Armies calculate, but they also interpret. Leaders must act not on perfect, godlike knowledge, but within a suffocating fog of fatigue, rumor, terror, and conflicting reports. A charismatic figure who successfully changes what men believe is possible instantly changes the menu of tactical decisions available at the very top. The English position, meanwhile, deserves equal historical seriousness. Far too many simplified retellings reduce the English to static, one-dimensional villains merely waiting around for a miraculous reversal. In reality, they were terrifyingly formidable because their grand strategy made perfect sense. They relied on heavily fortified, interlocking positions around Orléans, on continuous siege pressure, on complex alliance networks with Burgundy, and on the highly rational expectation that French political division would continue doing much of the heavy lifting for them. This expectation was not born of arrogance alone. It was an entirely rational reading of recent history. France had repeatedly, reliably demonstrated that its own internal weakness could be exploited far more effectively than risking everything on a single, decisive battlefield clash. But sound, rational strategy becomes dangerously brittle when it quietly assumes that the enemy will remain forever psychologically broken. That fundamental assumption was about to be violently tested. Joan entered Orléans in AD 1429 amid a city under immense, starvation-level strain. The strategic importance of that arrival cannot be reduced to mere pageantry, yet the pageantry itself was a crucial part of the weapon system. A threatened, despairing society desperately needs visual, undeniable proof that its terrifying inertia has ended. The French forces did not merely continue enduring the siege. They suddenly began acting as if ultimate victory were imaginable again. That singular shift in psychological expectation changed the tempo of the conflict, and tempo changes war. Once deep paralysis breaks, events can move with startling, almost uncontrollable speed, precisely because everyone involved has been waiting, often unconsciously, for undeniable evidence that the waiting is finally over. Brutal assaults against the English bastions, particularly the bloody storming of Les Tourelles, gathered unstoppable kinetic force. Commanders who might have previously hesitated found themselves operating in an entirely new, hyper-aggressive emotional climate. The besieged citizens and soldiers were no longer simply hoping to survive the winter. They were actively participating in a grand, cosmic drama of reversal. This is the true strategic heart of Orléans. The relief of the city was not just the logistical lifting of a military siege. It was a massive morale revolution with immediate, devastating military consequences. A brutal campaign that had seemed to definitively demonstrate the inevitable, suffocating tightening of English success suddenly suggested the exact opposite. Perhaps English pressure was vulnerable. Perhaps the Dauphin's cause was not dying. Perhaps, against all rational odds, divine favor had not deserted Valois France after all. The battlefield had successfully produced something vastly more valuable than local geographic safety. It had generated belief with supreme operational utility. Therefore, the subsequent lightning-fast lore campaign mattered far beyond its immediate tactical engagements. Momentum in a civil and dynastic war is a tangible political substance. Towns, nobles, mercenaries, and soldiers continuously recalculate where the arc of the future is moving. Neutrality in such conflicts is rarely permanent. It survives only while the outcomes seem uncertain enough to justify a cowardly delay. Once one side appears to carry the unstoppable weight of destiny itself, hesitant actors begin to aggressively shift their allegiances to avoid being caught on the losing side. This is exactly why the French victories immediately after Orléans reverberated so powerfully across the continent. They did not merely inflict severe casualties on English longbowmen and men-at-arms. They fundamentally altered the anticipations of everyone watching the chessboard. Hardened men who had lived through decades of fragmentation started quietly asking themselves whether the tide of history had permanently changed. Strategy in such wars is often the delicate, psychological art of making observers conclude that history has already made its choice. Joan's next great insistence revealed a genuinely remarkable, almost instinctual grasp of the deep structure of medieval power. She aggressively pressed for the army to march deep into hostile territory toward Reims so that the Dauphin could be officially crowned. On a purely narrow, logistical military reading, this might seem entirely secondary, or even dangerously reckless. Reims lay deep in a politically complex, heavily militarized landscape. The road carried immense risks of ambush. The war was absolutely not over, but a purely narrow military reading would entirely miss the point of how power functioned. In the 15th century, political legitimacy had to be grandly performed in order to become legally binding. A coronation at Reims was not a decorative, frivolous ceremony attached to power that was already secure. The coronation was itself an operational objective because it physically enacted the sacred grammar of French kingship. The anointing of the king with sacred oil in the traditional, ancient resting place of monarchs mattered deeply because rule is sustained by mass recognition, and mass recognition is almost always ritualized long before it is intellectually rationalized. Therefore, the march to Reims was one of the greatest strategic insights of the entire age. It sought not merely to conquer more territory, but to forge a transformed political reality. As heavily defended towns simply opened their gates and resistance faltered along the route without a single arrow being fired, the campaign demonstrated a profound truth, that immense symbolic pressure can become overwhelming practical leverage. Men submit far more readily to a power that looks preordained, inevitable, and already halfway triumphant. When Charles was finally crowned at Reims in AD 1429, the war did not end. That must be heavily stressed, because romantic retellings often rush blindly from the coronation straight to destiny fulfilled. The English still possessed terrifying military strength. The Duke of Burgundy still mattered immensely. The French state remained administratively fragile. But the symbolic hierarchy of Europe had been irreversibly altered. The Dauphin was now Charles VII in the old, sacred, undeniable language of the French monarchy. The catastrophic Treaty of Troyes had not literally disappeared, but its central claim to legal finality had been deeply, mortally wounded by a ritual fact. This crowning triumph was the absolute culmination of Joan's political usefulness and, paradoxically, the beginning of her profound danger to the very elites she had just helped rescue. For once legitimacy is successfully restored to a more manageable, bureaucratic level, the extraordinary, unpredictable instrument that helped restore it suddenly becomes deeply inconvenient. Court caution rapidly returned. Military campaigns around Paris faltered as Charles sought diplomatic treaties rather than holy war. Controlled diplomacy, measured strategy, and elite administrative management once again asserted themselves over visionary fervor. Joan's uncompromising mode of action was not easily absorbed into such a mundane system. She represented relentless urgency, absolute audacity, and a kind of authority derived directly from divine mission rather than through the proper channels of aristocratic procedure. That terrifying energy had been absolutely invaluable when France needed a jolt powerful enough to break a civilizational fatalism. But it was incredibly hard to accommodate once the monarchy sought bureaucratic stabilization rather than perpetual, exhausting exaltation. The incandescent symbol that saves a dynasty can deeply unsettle the administrators who must subsequently normalize it. Momentum, therefore, did not continue in a straight, unbroken line. History more often turns through messy bursts, bitter hesitations, and fiercely contested interpretations. Attempts against Paris failed to produce the decisive breakthrough Joan had promised. Political caution, strict military limits, and strategic friction fiercely reasserted themselves. Joan remained highly active in the field, but the political landscape around her had fundamentally changed. She was increasingly isolated. Then came the disaster of capture. At Compiègne in AD 1430, Joan fell into enemy Burgundian hands and was subsequently sold to the English. This was not simply the bad luck of medieval warfare. It was the explosive opening of a brand new battlefield, one where narrative and theology mattered just as much as steel. She was deliberately transferred into the orbit of English interests because her enemies understood something absolutely crucial about the mechanics of power. Imprisonment alone was insufficient. If Joan remained locked in a dungeon, merely unlucky in battle, her legend would survive entirely intact, continuing to legitimize Charles. She had to be systematically reclassified. The trial at Rouen in AD 1431 is among the most chilling, revealing episodes in the long history of the political use of law. Officially, the charges investigated by Bishop Pierre Cauchon and the University of Paris concerned heresy, spiritual error, and demonic deception. But the target of the trial was vastly larger than the terrified prisoner in the dock. If Joan's visions were legally proven to be fraudulent or demonic, then the entire chain of meaning leading from the miracle at Orleans to the coronation at Reims could be poisoned after the fact. If the messenger were condemned as a witch, perhaps the message of French resurgence could be totally destabilized. This was a masterclass in strategic jurisprudence. The courtroom was being aggressively weaponized to attack a coronation already accomplished, a dynasty already strengthened, and a narrative already spreading like wildfire through the French populace. Power, we must remember, does not rely on brute force alone. It also strictly classifies, intensely judges, and legally names realities into political being. The proceedings brutally exposed the deep asymmetry between towering, institutional bureaucracy and charismatic exception. Joan, whose entire authority had arisen from unyielding conviction and a personal divine mission, now faced months of highly trained, relentless clerical interrogation inside a legal structure specifically designed to convert any ambiguity into total guilt. Every complex theological answer could be aggressively twisted to threaten her. Every steadfast claim to direct divine guidance could be reframed by highly educated men as dangerous pride, theological error, or outright blasphemy. The institution sought not truth in some abstract, philosophical vacuum. It sought a politically usable verdict. Yet even here, the logic was not purely cynical. Medieval judges and clerics operated within a deeply held worldview where spiritual deception was considered a terrifying reality, and the strict policing of orthodoxy carried genuine, life-or-death seriousness for the souls of men. But the sincerity of their religious framework does not cancel out its devastating political utility. The trial's deepest, most fundamental function was to sever the miracle from the legitimacy, to turn a spectacular source of national renewal into legally documented evidence of mass delusion. Her execution by burning at the stake in AD 1431 was intended as a public elimination with immense pedagogical force. The aim was not only to physically kill Joan of Arc, reducing her body to ashes so no relics could be kept, but to transform her totally from a savior into a permanent cautionary example. Burned as a relapsed heretic, she would stand forever as a warning against false visions, peasant disobedience, and unauthorized sanctity. But here, the grand English strategy failed in the long run. Public punishment can certainly clarify a regime's absolute power, yet it can also expose its profound, underlying fear. A martyr is very often created at the exact point where massive institutions arrogantly believe they are finalizing a victory. Joan's horrific death did not successfully erase the memory of Orleans or the sacred anointing at Reims. It gave both of those events a supreme human sacrifice around which later national memory could permanently harden. The longer arc of the 100 Years' War proves the strict limits of judicial destruction. France did not collapse after Joan's ashes were thrown into the Seine. Charles VII's regime, often heavily underestimated by history because its eventual restoration was gradual, bureaucratic, and grinding rather than cinematic, steadily consolidated its position. It improved strict administrative control, revolutionized military structures with standing professional armies and modern artillery, and increasingly moved from improvised survival toward highly durable state capacity. This matters enormously. Joan did not single-handedly win the 100 Years' War. Such simplistic myths flatten the complex reality of history. But the monarchy she so crucially helped resuscitate at its lowest ebb eventually became strong enough to outlast, outgun, and permanently reverse English continental power. Her intervention was catalytic, not solitary. She did not complete the immense work of state building, but she was the spark that made its continuation politically imaginable when all hope was lost. Over time, the English position in mainland France fatally weakened. Alliances drastically shifted, resources strained to the breaking point. French recovery acquired unstoppable institutional form. Therefore, the true strategic significance of Joan becomes vastly clearer when seen in a wider sequence. She was not the ending of the story, but the absolutely essential pivot that made a different ending possible. The posthumous nullification trial, concluded in AD 1456, confirmed just how thoroughly the political reality of Europe had changed. The very same ecclesiastical civilization that had fiercely condemned Joan now miraculously found the legal and theological reasoning to reverse itself. This reversal did not emerge from a pure, spontaneous moral awakening detached from circumstance. It became possible precisely because the balance of geopolitical power and royal legitimacy had permanently moved. Charles VII, now securely victorious, could not afford to owe his crown to a condemned heretic. The record had to be cleansed. Victors do not merely write history. They meticulously rehabilitate memory in forms highly useful to the new order they have secured. Joan's initial condemnation had served one regime's desperately pressing needs. Her subsequent rehabilitation perfectly served another. That is not to say that objective truth was totally irrelevant. Only that truth in public, political life very often requires highly favorable political weather before it can be officially acknowledged at scale. Archives, legal tribunals, and royal declarations become active sites where sovereign power heavily revises the moral map, but usually only after the strategic landscape has already firmly changed. At the absolute center of Joan's story stands a profound, enduring paradox. She was absolutely indispensable as a living symbol when France needed resurrection from the grave. Yet she was deemed dangerously uncontrollable as a living human being once the elites sought to normalize their power again. Institutions in the grip of terminal crisis very often summon the extraordinary. But institutions recovering from crisis almost always fear what answered the summons. This recurring pattern reaches far beyond 15th century France. Societies sliding into absolute fatalism sometimes desperately require figures who violently rupture the expected script, who make passivity suddenly intolerable and confidence highly contagious. But hierarchy vastly prefers reliable tools, not unpredictable mysteries. It prefers legitimacy that can be filed, stamped, and administered, not legitimacy that arrives clothed in terrifying, uncompromising conviction. Therefore, extraordinary individuals are very often celebrated retrospectively far more easily than they are tolerated in real time. As historical memory, they can be safely arranged, sanitized, and sculpted into statues. As living agents, they constantly embarrass strategy, bypass procedure, and aggressively expose the inadequacy of established elites. Joan ultimately became infinitely safer for state power once she became dead, canonizable, and totally interpretable. Her story also fiercely resists crude reduction in another vital way. The deep relationship between religious faith and grand strategy here is not a simple, childish contest where one explanation cancels out the other. To the devoted believers, divine providence genuinely acted through Joan. To the cynical strategists, she functioned flawlessly as a catalytic asset who transformed morale, tempo, and legitimacy. History's much harder, vastly more complex truth is that both of these dimensions can completely operate at once. Human beings do not wage war as purely material, robotic calculators. They move through intricate structures of meaning. Deep belief changes real action. That action then changes physical institutions. Those institutions then reinterpret the original belief in the highly practical language of success or danger. The sacred and the strategic are deeply interwoven, not because one side is foolish or naive, but because political life itself has always utterly depended on shared stories about what is rightful, destined, or blessed. That is exactly why Joan of Arc and the Siege of Orléans remain so eternally haunting. They dramatically reveal a kingdom rescued not by arithmetic alone, not by siege technique alone, and not by pure charisma alone, but by the violent collision of all three inside a fleeting moment of near-terminal civilizational weakness. France did not simply need more soldiers with sharper swords. It desperately needed a reason to fundamentally believe that lawful order still possessed a future. The verdict of history is stark. Joan helped rescue a dying kingdom by restoring violent motion to a paralyzed cause and sacred credibility to a wounded, doubting crown. But the human and political cost was immense. Years more of grueling war, a martyr's agonizing death in the flames, and the terrifying exposure of just how incredibly fragile legitimacy becomes when law, force, and faith cease to reinforce one another. The modern mirror is equally unsettling. Contemporary societies speak entirely in secular, technocratic vocabularies, yet they still profoundly depend on a legitimacy that is part legal, part emotional, and entirely performative. Modern states survive not only by police coercion or bureaucratic procedure, but by meticulously maintaining the mass belief that their authority is justified, future-oriented, and intensely real. When that fragile belief frays, institutions inevitably begin searching for symbols, saviors, and spectacles capable of repairing shattered confidence. Then, once stability safely returns, those exact same institutions very often move to ruthlessly contain the very wild energies that revive them. The pattern is ancient because the human animal has changed far less than its glittering technologies. The legacy question, then, is not the simple puzzle of whether Joan was merely a saint or a strategist, a martyr or a manipulated instrument. It is something vastly more difficult to confront. When a civilization can no longer save itself through ordinary, rational means, what kind of terrifying truth is carried by the person who appears completely impossible, right up until the exact moment that success makes that impossibility undeniable?